Okay, so before we actually move on to the process of impeachment, which is where we left off yesterday, I want to talk about some of the things that we didn't get a chance to address in class because of our limited time. And that is some of the responsibilities that the president has as chief legislator, and then we'll get into some of the other issues that will come up as his responsibilities as commander in chief. So, in terms of his responsibility as chief legislator, one of the things that uh, will come up is that he can. In an emergency situation, he can call for an emergency session. So, say for example, the stock market crashes, or say for example, there is an act of war. The president has a constitutional opportunity, a constitutional responsibility, or the constitutional power, however you want to define it, to call Congress into an emergency session. So, if Congress happens to not be meeting, but something happens, the president has the power to call them out of their status of being at home and say, we've got to get back to work. You need to come back to Washington immediately. That is one of his powers. But the most important power he has as chief legislator is the power of the veto, VETO. And you guys should be aware of that. So, the power of the veto, of course, is his ability to say no, right? It's when Congress, both chambers, pass a bill and the president does not approve, right? So Congress just can't pass a bill and say this is going to be the law of the land. The president has the ability, even though he can't introduce a bill into Congress, even though he doesn't necessarily have the power to bring in legislation, he does have the power to veto or reject legislation, right? When we look at how the veto has been used historically, the first six presidents of the United States, so from George Washington all the way to John Quincy Adams, they use the veto very sparingly. If you look at all six of them, they used it a total of 10 times. And they used it only because they believed that a bill was unconstitutional. They didn't use it because of partisan reasons. So it's not because they didn't like the bill, they used the veto because they didn't think that it was constitutional. The guy who really challenges that and that practice would be Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, who was president number seven, will show up and start to use the veto in a very partisan way. He starts to veto bills on the grounds of policy, meaning he would veto bills because he didn't support the bill itself. He believed that the bill was something that he didn't like. It was too, it was something that he just didn't support. And he had, during his presidency, he had used the veto a total of 12 times during his time in office. And his use of the veto singularly uh, enhanced the authority of the president. The fact that that he redefined how the president used the veto is something that redefines and changes the role of the president, because the first six guys believed that the veto was something that you used when you thought Congress was acting outside of its role of the Constitution. And here comes Andrew Jackson saying, no, no, you can use the veto when you don't like the bill. This can be a partisan issue and not just a constitutional issue. So here's how the process of the veto works, and make sure you understand this also. When it comes to the process of the veto, um, when the bill comes to the president's desk, the president has 10 days to sign or reject a bill. And if it's, if he doesn't sign it within those 10 days, and if Congress is still in session, then the bill has been passed. So you have, as President of the United States, 10 days to make a decision. Either you sign it or you veto it. And if the president doesn't sign within 10 days and Congress goes on vacation, it's considered a pocket veto. So it's been vetoed, and you've got to come. Congress will have to come back and deal with it then. Um, the thing is that this issue of vetoes can be overridden. So Congress can override a veto, but they need 2/3 of the congressional uh, support, right? So Congress will have to, like the House of Representatives, will have to override the president's veto. It has to be an overwhelming majority. That's the key. And here's the thing: when a president vetoes a bill, present day, it's more often than not a partisan issue. But the idea of it coming back to Congress and being overridden is usually a partisan issue as well. That's how it's evolved over the years. So when we talk about this issue of uh, his role as chief diplomat, one of the things that's evolved as well is his role as leader of our foreign policy. Here's the thing: the Constitution has given the president the sole authority and the sole responsibility of negotiating treaties. Okay. But here's the kicker: while the president has the responsibility of negotiating treaties, it is the Senate's responsibility to approve those treaties. So the president can negotiate, but just because he negotiates the treaty doesn't mean that those treaties are done. He has to bring those treaties back to Congress, and Senate has to approve of them. And it's the same sort of process that a bill goes through. The treaty has to come to a committee. The committee has to read through the treaty. It has to go through the process of being voted upon by the committee. The committee decides whether or not things need to be added to it or adjusted upon it. Then the committee will present it to the Senate, and the Senate has to approve it by a 2/3 vote. So the president can't just go anywhere and everywhere and support any kind of treaty and sign any kind of treaty. This is something that comes up after World War One. Woodrow Wilson signs the Treaty of Versailles after World War One, comes back, brings the treaty there, brings the treaty to Washington D.C., and the Senate refused to ratify it. In fact, it goes through the Senate 3 different times, 3 different versions of it, and it is not ratified any of the 3 times. The United States does not ratify that treaty. So it's an indication of how important it is that the president works with the Senate in order to negotiate these treaties. You can't just, as president of the United States, go to any foreign country and negotiate a treaty and think that everybody is going to approve of it. You have to work closely with the Senate, especially Senate leadership, especially those leaders who are on committees dealing with foreign policy, and they have to know what you are up to. Also, in terms of diplomacy, one of the things that the president has to remember and has the power to do is grant diplomatic recognition. In other words, recognizing another government as legitimate. In other words, this is a real government, and therefore we are open to doing business with them. We are open to trade with them. We are open to peace treaties with them, that sort of thing. So, for example, Harry Truman officially recognized the nation of Israel in 1948. Jimmy Carter officially recognized China in 1978. Bill Clinton officially recognized Vietnam in 1995. To this day, um, the United States does not have diplomatic relations with Iran. Um, Donald Trump tried to establish diplomatic relations with North Korea, and in fact did to a certain extent. He talked extensively about exchanging, as he described, beautiful letters with Kim Jong Il and that sort of thing. But officially, there is no diplomatic relationship there. The president also, in terms of these relationships, can enter into an executive agreement with a head of state um, that does not need Senate approval. So instead of a treaty, you can enter into an executive agreement. But the problem with an executive agreement is that the executive agreement only lasts as long as the presidential term. So, for example, if Donald Trump, since I just mentioned him, if Donald Trump had entered into an executive agreement with Kim Jong il, that executive agreement only lasted as long as Donald Trump's presidency. So as soon as Donald Trump left office, that executive agreement came to an end. It was over. And as soon as Joe Biden became president, then we entered into a new era of the relationship. So that's the problem. There are limitations, and this is what you have to understand. There are purposeful and intentional limitations to the kind of relationships that the president can establish with foreign powers, and that's done on purpose. That's intentional. It's trying to make sure that the president can, within reason, negotiate with other countries, but at the same time be held accountable to the Senate and make sure that these relationships are reasonable, that they are relationships that make sense and that are beneficial to the United States, right? And when we talk about those relationships and when we talk about that sort of responsibility, it leads me to his responsibility as commander in chief again, right? When we talk about this responsibility, remember one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that the United States has the most powerful military resources in the world. The United States has over 1 million people um, signed up in the military, over 1 million people in uniform, right? And that's just individuals. That's not taking into consideration the planes, the tanks, the ships, the guns, the artillery, all of that stuff, the bombs, any of that. Um, and while he is not expected to lead troops into battle, he is expected to make these key military decisions, set up military governments in conquered countries, deploying troops, conducting war, all of that stuff. And so when he has that level of responsibility, that's why it's important that Congress still maintains the responsibility of declaring war. And I hope that when we discuss that on Thursday, this explanation makes it clear of why the president's responsibilities are curtailed in that way. There is a tremendous amount of power that the executive branch holds, even within the Constitution. And a lot of this is going to be expanded and stretched and tested over the years from George Washington to present day. Franklin Roosevelt is going to push that, push that, and push that. And then it's going to be expanded even more once we get into the 21st century. I mean, once you have uh, Bill Clinton, and then when 9/11 hits, George W. Bush is going to take that even further. So the powers and responsibilities of the presidency are going to be pushed to the extremes. So the Constitution will find ways to curtail the powers of the president as much as possible. But it is dependent on members of Congress, members specifically of the House of Representatives and the Senate, to be aware of what those powers are, to be constitutionally aware of what those powers are, so that they can hold the president and hold members of the executive branch accountable to the Constitution. And that is absolutely, absolutely important. And that's what leads me to this whole idea of the impeachment process. I want to talk about, first of all, why it's important that the impeachment process be instilled. And it begins with a conversation um, that Ben Franklin introduces. So Ben Franklin says that there has to be something in place, a process in place in the Constitution that allows for the removal of officials from the executive branch out of office. Because if not, and this is a direct quote, if not, quote, we surely will have assassination. We surely will have assassination. Here's what he means. He says, listen, if someone is in office at the executive level and they abuse their power and they are not held accountable to the law, then someone will remove them from office in a violent way. There will be a violent overthrow of that person and a violent removal of them from office. That's what he's saying here. We surely will have assassination, means that that person will be violently removed from office because they'll be assassinated. So impeachment is the idea that that person holding office will be held accountable to the law, that even the president of the United States is not above the law. That's the key. Impeachment is the idea that even as president of the United States, you are held accountable to the law, that you as the leader of the country are not above the law, you are held accountable to the law. So when we talk about um, where impeachment can be found in the Constitution, if you look at Article um, 1, that's where it explains who is in charge of the process of impeachment, and that is entirely the responsibility of Congress. Congress is in charge of how the process takes place, and Article 2 explains that the president, the vice president, and any government official can be impeached on the grounds of treason, bribery, and high crimes and misdemeanors. So we know why we should have impeachment, because if we don't, we surely will have assassination. And now we know who's in charge of it and who can be held accountable to it and why, right? On the grounds of treason, so treachery, if you are a traitor, if you've betrayed your country or your office, the president, the vice president, any government official, um, treason, bribery, if someone has extorted money from you or bribed you with office, or bribed you with power, and high crimes and misdemeanors, if you have done something extremely felonious, that is problematic as well. So let's talk about the actual process of impeachment. So when we talk about the process of it, it begins with the House of Representatives. So the House of Representatives is essentially the grand jury in this process. So the House of Representatives is where you will actually decide if this official will be impeached. They are, if you're in a trial process, remember there is a process at the very beginning of any big trial situation where you might hear that this is going to go to the grand jury to decide whether or not there should be an indictment. So, in this particular part of the process, the House of Representatives serves as the grand jury. Okay. And the grand jury, in this case, the House of Representatives, will decide if there is enough evidence for indictment. So they decide, okay, what's the evidence here? Where, how do we decide? Is there enough? And the House of Representatives will actually vote on it. And all they need is a simple majority vote. That's the kicker here. You have to make sure that when we talk about impeachment, and here's the thing, you can bring up charges of impeachment all you want, but you better have a rock solid case here, because this is something that could be very embarrassing for you, the person bringing up the charges, right? This is a huge deal. People talk about impeachment all the time. um, this comes up literal as this is especially since the 1990s. um, so since the 1990s, this has become a much more partisan issue, where anytime a president was elected, immediately there would be talk of impeachment. And there wouldn't even have to be a good reason. They would just say, well, we're going to find a reason to impeach them. What are you talking about? Impeachment is such a high level charge to throw at anyone. And quite frankly, it is so deeply divisive. It is so deeply harmful to the country that you don't want to do an impeachment, and you shouldn't want to. That it should never be the goal of any party to have an impeachment trial. It is embarrassing. It is really embarrassing to have an impeachment trial. There is nothing to boast about for either party to have an impeachment trial. Um, because you are talking about whether it is the president, the vice president, or any official. It is it is it is something that is aired for all the world to see. So it is quite embarrassing, to be frank. So when we talk about what impeachment really means, impeachment only means that there is, excuse me, impeachment only means that there is just enough evidence to stand trial. That's the key. Impeachment means that there is enough evidence to stand trial. Impeachment doesn't necessarily mean that this person has um, uh, done all of these things or settled it. It just means that they've been sent to trial. And I will say this again, to be impeached is humiliating. It is a scar on your career. It is historically terribly embarrassing. The actual trial, right? The actual, I'm not sure why it goes through there. The actual trial takes place in the Senate. Okay. So the Senate will oversee the trial. And here's what ends up happening. And I'm not sure how many of you remember this from the previous impeachment, the second impeachment of uh, uh, President Trump. But how this goes is the Senate will host the trial, but the House of Representatives will send over what they would call their prosecutors, right? Their prosecution, and they are the ones who will present their case. Okay. Um, the Senate is presided by not the vice president. The Senate is presided by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. That's where the Supreme Court gets involved. So the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over the Senate, and The House of Representatives has to present their case, and in order to get a guilty conviction, you must have 2/3 of the senators voting guilty. So, in other words, that is 66 senators. 66 senators have to vote guilty um, in order for the person to be removed from office. So, in order for it to get to the Senate, that person has been impeached. But to be removed, the Senate has to vote guilty. So if it's been sent to the Senate, then yes, that person has officially been impeached. Now, to be removed, the Senate would have to vote guilty. So let's talk about the history of impeachment. 3 presidents in the history of the United States have been impeached. None of them have been found guilty. The first president that was impeached was Andrew Johnson. He's the president who comes right after Abraham Lincoln. He was, so technically, he's the 17th president. He uh, was impeached by the House of Representatives. It goes to trial in the Senate. He missed being removed from the Senate by one vote. One single vote is what prevented him from being removed from office. Just one. So it's the closest that he gets. So he remains in office for the rest of his time. Bill Clinton was the second to have been impeached, but it doesn't even come close in the Senate. It was never going to happen in the Senate, actually. So he was impeached in the House of Representatives. He was impeached in the House of Representatives. It goes to the Senate, and then of course there's Donald Trump. Now, all 3 of these presidents were impeached under highly partisan circumstances. So Andrew Johnson was a Democrat, a Southern Democrat who was impeached by radical Republicans. Bill Clinton, a Democrat, was impeached by a very, very conservative Republican Congress. And then, of course, Donald Trump was impeached twice by Democrats in Congress. So this leaves many experts to conclude that the process just is just very partisan at the heart of it. Now, here's the thing: Bill Clinton, of these 3 men, Bill Clinton is the one guy who is impeached and leaves uh, the presidency, one of the most popular presidents in the history of the country. He leaves office with some of the highest ratings um, as outgoing president. So the impeachment actually doesn't hurt him nearly as much as people, especially Republicans, had hoped it would, because people saw it for what it was. He was impeached because he lied about having an affair. The other 2 guys, it was very different circumstances, extremely different. Donald Trump, of course, is the only president to be impeached twice. And he's the only president to be impeached twice in one term. So he holds 2 very dubious records. And for those of you wondering about Richard Nixon never even allowed the House to vote on impeachment because he knew it was going to be bad from the very beginning. So he resigned before that ever even happened. Okay, so let's deal with the amendments that specifically address the presidency. So let's begin with the 12th Amendment, which was ratified in 1804. The 12th Amendment provided separate ballots for the vice presidential and presidential candidates. And this was passed and ratified as a result of what took place in the election of 1800. So let me just give you a little bit of background here. When we talk about the election of 1800, there were four candidates. And the problem with these four candidates is they're all representing four different parties, right? So there's John Adams, Charles Pinckney, Thomas Jefferson, and Aaron Burr. Um, no, well, they're representing three. Well, don't worry about it. Okay, so John Adams was the sitting president. He's running for reelection. Thomas Jefferson was the sitting vice president. And then there's Charles Pinckney and Aaron Burr. So what ends up happening is these four guys end up running for president. John Adams doesn't have a chance of being reelected, so he loses very quickly. And Charles Pinckney doesn't do very well, but uh, uh, so he loses after a few ballots, and so then it goes between Jefferson and Burr over and over and over again. And we discussed this back on Tuesday, but one of the issues that comes up is if you don't win enough electoral votes, the House of Representatives votes over and over and over again until someone is decided. So you've got to, at that point, the Constitution did not have the decision of the House of Representatives will vote for president and the Senate will vote for vice president or anything like that. At that point, the Constitution said the winner would be the winner of the most votes would be the president, and the runner-up would be vice president. But the problem is that um you know there was this assumption that everybody was going to stick with that George Washington mentality of we don't need political parties, everybody's going to get along just like friends and brothers, political parties are too divisive. Well, that's not happening here. By 1800, everybody's already really deeply divided. It's all along party lines. um, the Federalist Party had been very strongly created. Adams was going to be their guy. And then there's the other party, the new party known as the Democrat Republicans. That's one word. And Jefferson was going to be their guy. And Aaron Burr, who used to be a Federalist, switched parties and became a Democrat Republican. And Thomas Jefferson found that super annoying. So here you have political parties suddenly established, and the Constitution doesn't address what happens with political parties, right? So Burr and Jefferson kept tying each other with 71 electoral votes. And it kept going back and forth, and the Constitution says, well, whoever gets the most votes gets to be the president. Um, if it had been clear that Jefferson was the presidential candidate and Burr was the vice presidential candidate, or vice versa, then this would have been resolved and everything would have been fine. But that was never set. Instead, it keeps going for 35 ballots. So 35 different times the House of Representatives had to vote. And finally, finally, after some intervention, including intervention from Alexander Hamilton, Hamilton writes the letter to the Federalists and he says, um, I don't like Thomas Jefferson, but I really hate Aaron Burr. And at least Thomas Jefferson is a guy, you know where he stands, you know what his principles are. And I'd rather have a guy who is in leadership where I know where he stands and I know what his values are. I'd rather have him in leadership than a guy like Aaron Burr. That's the guy that I would vote for. And Federalists say, yeah, he's right. And there are others who echo the same thing. That's why it was necessary. to avoid this sort of confusion. Um, there are amendments that are going to come along that are going to deal with this same sort of issue. What about this sort of confusion about power, confusion about leadership? The 20th Amendment of 1933 addresses, or is known as, the lame duck amendment. The lame duck amendment is called that because it creates a new inauguration date. Here's why. So originally, presidents were always elected in November, but originally they did not become president until March. So they would be inaugurated on March 4th of the following year. So there were 4 months that would go between election and inauguration. And the problem with that, or the reason why that was introduced in the first place, is it was designed to give the new president, time to get everything in order. And, of course, early on, that made sense. It takes time. To get your communications across. There are transportation problems, all of that stuff. But by 1933, communication, transportation, that's not a problem anymore, right? You've got telephones, you've got telegraphs, you can send all sorts of messages easy. So you don't have the same kind of communication issues in 1933 as you did in 1833. So there's no reason why you need 4 months. And here's the thing: being a lame duck president means that uh, once you've either lost your reelection bid, or after your 8 years, you're done being president. And so that time between November and inauguration, you're just sitting there, doing nothing. That means you're a lame duck. That lengthy time period led to some serious problems. Like, for example, um the time period between the end of James Buchanan's presidency and Abraham Lincoln's presidency, is really problematic. So Abraham Lincoln becomes president, or is elected to the presidency, in November of 1860, but he's not inaugurated until March of 1861. What happens in those 4 months? 11 states secede from the Union. 11. And this moron, James Buchanan, and I proudly call him that because he is the worst president in the history of the United States. The worst. Um, does nothing. He does absolutely nothing. And he says, "Well, I'm powerless to do anything, and I'm gonna try and do my absolute best," but he does literally nothing. So, um, when we talk about that 4 month time period, it's a waste of time. It causes a lot of chaos. So, when we talk about the new inauguration date for the presidency, it sets it at January 20th for the presidential inauguration and January 3rd for Congress. Okay. Now, if the president elect dies before inauguration, the vice president elect will become president. So, there are contingencies set in place, right? Um, so they've got ideas and plans in place just in case, right? I've talked about why it was necessary. Okay, the 22nd Amendment. All right. Now, this amendment is the amendment that limits a president to 2 terms, or 10 years if they finish out the term of a president who died or resigned from office. So you are limited to 2 terms, 8 years, or if you finished out the term of a president, um, and then you ran for the office and won, and then you won again, you are able to serve for a maximum of 10 years. Okay, so let's talk about why. So, there had been at the Constitutional Convention, at the very beginning, there had been a lot of conversation about the length of a president's term. And um, the original conversation was the president should only serve one term, but the one term should be 6 years. And so there's a lot of back and forth. Eventually, it was decided that the term would be 4 years, but you can serve an unlimited number of terms. And um, Washington thought that was bizarre. Washington was like, okay, first of all, I'm an old man. Secondly, I have served for my adult life. I'm tired. I'm going to retire and go to my fantastic house in Virginia and look out on the river, and you can leave me alone. So after the two terms, he steps down, and when he's confronted about this, which he absolutely is by multiple members of his cabinet, he says, look, if I stay here forever, I am going to be like a king. And that's exactly what we don't want. What we want to teach the country how to do is transition. Um, but the thing is that that wasn't a written rule. It was a precedent that Washington set in place. And everyone who followed Washington just followed him by example. So serving only two terms just became this self regulating limitation. And very few people strayed from that. So there are guys who would serve the terms, but they might just serve the two terms just in different ways. Like, for example, Grover Cleveland would win in 1884, but he would lose in 1888. But then he would um, run and win again in 1892. So he ran three times, but he would win twice, and it worked. Teddy Roosevelt became president when he was first a vice president, but McKinley, the president, was assassinated just a few months into his term. So Teddy Roosevelt became president because the president was assassinated. And then he ran on his own right, and then became president on his own terms in 1904. And then he decided um, that he was not going to run for reelection immediately after. He could have, but he did not. Then he decided he was going to run again in 1912, but he didn't win. So it's off and on. Now, the guy who breaks the rules, we talked about this the other day, is Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt is the guy who runs in 32, 36, 40, and 44. And he wins every single time. He wins 4 presidential terms. And he is inaugurated 4 times. He dies um, in April of 1945, just a few months into his fourth term. He was a very sick man, very sickly, and dies just a few months into his fourth term. And this is the thing, um, because he had run for office 4 times and won 4 times, that's why this 22nd Amendment comes around. Republicans especially were like, "What in the world? This guy broke the rule." But there was no rule. It was just a self-regulating limitation. Even some Democrats were like, "Oh, I don't think we should do that again." Right? So Franklin Roosevelt is the reason why it's necessary. Then there's the 25th Amendment, 1967. So the 25th Amendment deals with this issue. If the president dies or resigns, The vice president shall become president. Now, I can kind of guess what you're thinking, and that is, wasn't that already a rule? Wasn't that already assumed? And the answer to your question is no. Here's why. So, this is sort of um, it's previously stated in the Constitution. This is a provision. Um, there's a provision in this amendment that is necessary, and here's why. So, William Henry Harrison was the first president to die in office, and he dies in office because he's an idiot. He was inaugurated to become president, and then he was in a freezing storm. It was freezing cold outside. He decided to speak, give an incredibly long speech during his inauguration in the freezing cold. He gets pneumonia and dies like a month into office. He spoke for like 90 minutes or something, 90 minutes or 2 hours, something like that. But he ends up getting pneumonia and he dies. Anyway, so because of that, John Tyler, his vice president, who went home to Virginia because he's thinking, okay, well, it was good to see you, William Henry Harrison, but I'm vice president now, and that means I have nothing to do. So I'm going to go to Virginia. So John Tyler becomes president. Many people thought Tyler should only be president temporarily. And Tyler said, no, because I'm the vice president. So the assumption should be that as vice president, the president has died. I should just assume the power of vice president. So there was a legit debate on whether or not there should be an election, um, and people should run again for office. Um, but but what people argued is no, this it would cost too much money to conduct a no whole other election. So no, John Tyler is going to be the vice president of the United States. As other presidents died in office, their vice presidents would become president of the United States. But the cloud that somehow um, hung over them was that they were temporary, right? So this is the provision that makes it clear that no, there are no other conditions, there are no questions, no doubts about it. There is no implications here. This is putting it in black and white in print. The vice president takes over. There is no questions about who is in charge right now. And this is the thing. This becomes really problematic because it's important to the country that everybody knows who's in charge. Ronald Reagan was shot, and at a press conference, famously, the Secretary of State got on television and said, I'm in charge here, or I'm in control, and everything is fine. No, he's not in charge here. It's the vice president, George H.W. Bush, who's supposed to be in charge, because that's what the Constitution says. The Constitution, here's the problem, had no provision allowing for the replacement of a vice president. There were several presidents who served without vice presidents, especially those who became president upon the death of a president. So, for those vice presidents who became president of the United States, under the 25th Amendment, the president could nominate someone and Congress would approve with a majority vote. So, the 25th Amendment basically says if the president dies or resigns, the VP shall become president. But also, if the VP becomes president, that new president will then nominate someone to become vice president, and the Congress will have to approve with a majority vote. So, a good example of this is Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon had a vice president. His name was Spiro Agnew. Spiro Agnew was brought up on charges of impeachment. and was forced to resign. And so Richard Nixon chose a new vice president named Gerald Ford. And Gerald Ford was a guy that everybody in the House of Representatives really liked. So a majority of them voted for him. When Richard Nixon resigned, Gerald Ford became president of the United States. And therefore, here's a little bit of trivia. He's the first non elected president and the first non elected vice president and the only non elected president and vice president in American history. Ford chose Nelson Rockefeller to be his vice president. And Rockefeller was never elected either. Rockefeller was voted upon by Congress as well. Um, so there you go. I mean, Nixon's presidency had all sorts of leftover trauma. Um, if the president is temporarily disabled and is unable to carry out his functions as president, so let's say, for example, the president has to have surgery, which which has happened before. What he does is he's got to inform the Speaker of the House, and he has to inform the president pro tem in writing. So he's got to write them a letter and say, I will be unable to serve out my duties as president of the United States, and in my stead, the vice president will serve as the president. And and do this with the 25th Amendment in place. And so then, after he comes out of surgery and is fully alert, the president will then inform Congress in writing that he is able to resume his duties. I'll give you a good example of this. During the Bill Clinton presidency, Bill Clinton was on vacation and he fell and hurt his knee, and he tore some cartilage or something, and it required surgery. And so, because of that, he had to sign a letter that said, Al Gore my vice president, will be president for this many hours while I'm in surgery. And then, after he got out of surgery and was fully alert and everything was fine, he then had to sign a letter that said, okay, I'm back on the job. Um, what if, though, the president suffers a long-term disability? What if he is, God forbid, in a car crash and ends up in a coma, or something happens like that? Um, like, say, for example, with John F. Kennedy, what if he didn't die, but he ended up in a permanently disabled state? The 25th Amendment um, is supposed to establish a clear way for the vice president to succeed, right? The vice president and the majority of the president's cabinet would have to use the 25th Amendment to inform Congress about the state of the president, and then install the vice president as the president of the United States. And if and when the president believes that he can resume his duties, then he himself will inform Congress. If the vice president and the majority of the cabinet disagree and believe that the president just cannot return to his responsibilities, they have to inform Congress. And Congress will have to be the ones to decide, can this person serve as president of the United States? I mean, um, this is the thing. What what is really gray here in terms of debate is what constitutes a disability, right? So we know things like, okay, being in a coma, for example. Then we know, okay, obviously the president can't serve if if they're in a coma. But what if this person is, like, say, for example, right now, people have been talking about Vladimir Putin becoming much more isolated, becoming much more paranoid. What if that sort of situation were to happen here, does that constitute a disability? I mean, the problem here has been that that word disability hasn't really been constitutionally defined. And so it's really problematic, and nobody really knows what that means or how to go forward um, from there. So, with all that in mind, I'm going to introduce what would or who would be the ones to help define that. And that would be the judicial branch. The judicial branch is addressed in Article 3 of the Constitution. And here's the problem with Article 3. Uh, Article 3 is uh, explaining the judicial branch in what is essentially the least defined branch of the federal government. The Constitution establishes the Supreme Court in this article, but it essentially also allows Congress to define the rest of the federal court system. So when we talk about what Congress can do and the power of Congress, Congress has authority to a certain extent over the judicial branch in terms of establishing some limits over the judicial branch, right? But the judicial branch has a lot of leeway here as well. So a judge can be appointed with this is within the federal system. A judge can be appointed for life and can also be removed from office via the impeachment process. The other thing that you should know about Article 3 is that this is the only article that defines treason. And treason is important because it is the only crime that is defined in the Constitution. Treason, let me go back here. I don't know what just happened. Treason is defined as this: aiding or abetting the enemy or waging war against the United States. Treason is aiding or abetting, ABETTING, aiding or abetting the enemy, or waging war against the United States. There must be two witnesses to this event. There must be two witnesses. At least two people have had to admit that they saw you committing treason. And punishment for this crime is determined by Congress. But the punishment is specifically for the person who committed treason. It is not for the family. And that is specifically explained in the Constitution. The punishment is for the perpetrator and not for the perpetrator's family. So when John Wilkes Booth assassinates Abraham Lincoln and does it in the name of the Confederacy, and even though the Confederates were had essentially committed treason, and here he is assassinating the leader of what he would define as a foreign nation, what the Constitution is saying is he should be punished, but his family should not be. That's essentially what Article 3 is defining here. And what we will do is when we come back together on Tuesday, is talk about the expectations of the federal courts and the limits of the Supreme Court.